Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor to introduce our 2015 Eaton Lecturer and a dear personal friend of mine, Professor Terry Copp. He is a distinguished Professor Emeritus at the Department of History at Wilfrid Laurier University, and he's best known nationally and internationally for his groundbreaking histories of Canada's Second World War, fought from Juno Beach through to the Netherlands and Germany, including Fields of Fire, the Canadians in Normandy, and Cinderella Army, the Canadians in Northwest Europe, just to name a few of his long list of publications. Some of you might also be familiar with his work on combat stress and battle exhaustion. He launched the first wave of a great shift in thinking about the citizen army raised in this nation that successfully fought and won a very skillful and dangerous opponent during the Second World War. Professor Copp made his mark in the discipline by asking tough new questions and mining mountains of evidence from the perspective not just of generals, but of mid-grade and junior officers, as well as of the fighting soldier. Many of us here tonight also know Professor Copp as a co-founder and longtime director of the Laurier Center for Military Strategic and Disarmament Studies, and as Dr. Brown just said, the sister center and close partner of our own UNB Gregg Center. Terry shares our vision to take history and historical research out of the classroom and make it accessible and relevant to Canadians of all types. In that sense, it is a very special honor to introduce him to you tonight, because 20 years ago, he implemented this idea to train the next generation of young Canadian leaders as guardians of history and memory of Canada's experience in 2 world wars overseas. In 1995, he brought a band of us from across the sea to Europe to study those places on the earth where Canadians made their mark on global history. He conceptualized and organized and led the very first Canadian Battlefields Foundation study tour in June of 1995. I was one of his MA students at the time and fortunate enough to be chosen to go along. Terry challenged all of us to study the terrain as key evidence to better understand how the people of the past overcame the military problems of their time. He challenged us to think about how history and commemoration must remain separate, but at the same time how they're dependent. And he made us face that reality that we can't begin to try to commemorate without understanding what happened and why. 20 years later, his idea, as you've heard, has ballooned across the country and is delivered by an army of Terry's colleagues and graduate students. And indeed, he's provided the inspiration for the Gregg Center's current very active program of research, study tours offered in Sicily, Italy, France, Belgium, Germany, and the Netherlands. These programs offer opportunities for our faculty and our graduate students to carry out new research on the ground and to test new findings with critical groups of students, Canadian Forces members, school teachers, and even the general public. So I must offer congratulations to Terry on this 20th anniversary of what's now a powerful national movement. He's here tonight to reflect on over 3 decades of work on one particular subject, close to his interests and close to his heart. I'm referring to the little-known Canadian struggle in the Netherlands in late 1944. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Terry Copp.
Well, thank you very much, Lee. I advise all of you when you're being introduced to try and get one of your students to do it. I really appreciate everything that Lee said. What I'm going to do tonight is to talk about operations to clear the approaches to the port of Antwerp in September, October 1944. And I'm going to try very hard to do some of the things that Lee talked about. I'm going to try and show you something about the terrain and the impact of the challenges upon the soldiers at the sharp end. But I'm also going to take you up to the other level, because military history is partly about the experience of war, but it's partly about the direction of operations, rather larger, complex ways of bringing power to bear on the battlefield. And it is also, of course, about strategy, about the ways in which Field Marshal Montgomery, General Eisenhower, Harry Crerar, Guy Simmons, the senior decision makers tried to understand the problems before them and resolve them to the best of their ability. And as Elise said, it is also important to remember throughout what we're doing that we do want to understand the process of commemoration. We want to understand what it is we should remember, why we should remember it. In other words, we should work, to use the phrase that I endlessly instruct students with, we don't simply want remembrance, we want informed memory. Because two of the most important chapters in Canadian history occurred on the battlefields of Europe in the First and the Second World War. And those stories, that aspect of our past, is a vital part of who we are as a people. So we need to know about it, and we need to think about ways in which we could remember it. I start off with Alex Colville's painting, famous to many of you. It's called Infantry at Nijmegen. But in fact, Colville had arrived from Italy and the south of France in early October 1944 and became closely associated with the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, which was to be involved in the clearance, as you'll see, of what is called the Breskin's Pocket. So Colville's first sketches, he didn't paint in oils till he'd done a lot of sketching, were done in October 1944, and from then he drew some of the images that are so important in his career as a war artist. And while I don't want to push too hard, these weary infantrymen moving through the fall of 1944, this would be an image from November or December 1944, are the men who had fought the battle to clear the approaches to the port of Antwerp. And as you will see at the end of the lecture, they were allowed 4 days off between actions in the Scheldt estuary and moving into what was called the Nijmegen salient. But if they look tired, if they look worn, it's because they were. And we'll talk about those men as well as the framework within which they operated. This is an air photograph we had taken for our battlefield guide to the operations surrounding the October 1944. You can see very clearly a large German pillbox on the north side of what is called the Leopold Canal on the Dutch-Belgian border in Flanders. And if I can go forward, this is what it looks like somewhat more up close. I think in this picture, the looming character of the large blockhouse would become evident, and the weather is more appropriate to an October battle. But what the picture doesn't show clearly is that on either side of the pillbox is an aperture in which machine guns firing in what the military call enfilade down the canal are positioned. Now, this particular pillbox remains in place and can be visited today. Most of the other fortifications in the area have long since disappeared. But I show it to you at the beginning of the lecture because when I was beginning the study of military history back in the early 1980s, I had come to the situation from a very odd background. As a historian, I was working in the field of social and labor history. My first book was called The Anatomy of Poverty, the Condition of the Working Class in Montreal, and it had very little to do with military history. And I came into the field by accident, without previous study. Well, I had spent 2 summers in the Canadian Officers Training Corps, but apart from that, my military background or reading was minimal. I came to start military history because my best friend and mentor, the late Dr. Robert Vogel of McGill University, was a military historian. He was going on sabbatical leave after 2 terms of Dean of Arts at McGill, and he and I said, what research project could we do together? Now, I knew I wasn't going to turn Bob into a labor historian, so I turned myself into a military historian. And I went overseas because, not having read Clausewitz and not being terribly interested in reading him, I wanted to start from the ground up, literally. And Linda and I borrowed an old leaky MG and made our first trip through this section of Belgium and Holland. And I've often said to students afterwards, my entire research agenda as I started writing military history occurred studying this pillbox and the terrain at the Leopold Canal. Because the official historian C.P. Stacey had provided a very brief, accurate, but very brief description of the events on that October day, October 6, 1944, but there was nothing that explained what had happened. And I knew that the Royal Montreal Regiment on the left and the Regina Rifle Regiment on the right had tried to cross that canal in the midst of heavy fire coming from all directions, and that in the course of the morning, the best that they had been able to do was to grab positions on the bank of the canal, which became what we call in military history a kind of reverse slope, and they could dig in that reverse slope and just barely hold the northern bank of the canal. So what I wanted to know from that day forward is who these people were. Who were these people who met that degree of challenge? But I also wanted to know why. I wanted to know what were the circumstances that led, in this particular case, Dan Spry, the divisional commander, and Guy Simmons, the army commander, to order 2 infantry battalions which had landed on D-Day, which had fought through the entire Battle of Normandy, were then turned into the siege warfare along the Channel coast at Boulogne and Calais, and then with less than 48 hours between the clearance of Calais and Cap Gris-Nez, they were told to rip off their gray badges that identified them as the 3rd Division and move quickly to the Leopold Canal, where 2 days later they would have to begin an assault crossing of a heavily defended defensive position. Let me push this for just a second. One of the points that I've tried to make repeatedly is in many of the battles which are characteristic of the Canadian effort in the Second World War, the Canadians were in fact fighting against very, very considerable odds. Inside the Breskens pocket, behind the Leopold Canal and beyond, was an entire German infantry division. The 64th Infantry Division, as good a division as the Germans possessed in 1944. So the actual battle for that area was carried out in which the odds were roughly, under best circumstances, 1-to-1. Now it's supposed to need, if you're the attacker, odds as much as 3-to-1 to attack the enemy successfully, and much more than that to attack an enemy that's in a heavily fortified position. So I wanted to know who these men were, I wanted to know how they were asked to do it, and then I wanted to know how they'd succeeded in accomplishing the enormous task that had presented to them. So this was my epiphany, this was where my research agenda started, and Linda and I keep returning to the Scheldt area, estuary, or Schelde as the Dutch would prefer me to call it, and I've tried repeatedly to further my understanding. One of the things that I was able to do in the 1980s, which was very important to me, was that I was able to meet a lot of veterans. And over the course of the next decade, literally more than 150 veterans that I worked with and did interviews with and acquired information from became people whom I related to over time. By the 90s, it was becoming increasingly difficult to find that number of veterans, and of course today it is extremely difficult as so many have left us under the circumstances of time. Now, strategy. When the Battle of Normandy ended on the 21st of August 1944, in the sense of the rout of the German army from Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives and what was called the Falaise Gap North, the armies sprung out of Normandy like star shells, heading off in all directions without anything very much in the way of central control. That wasn't anybody's fault. It was a product of where German resistance was strong and where was it weak. In the course of late August and early September 1944, an enormous and acrimonious strategic debate started between General Eisenhower and his officers and General Montgomery and his officers over the proper strategy to pursue, and I'm going to pause and say this because I'm going to say it 2 or 3 times, because everyone believed and hoped the possibility existed that the war could end in 1944. Let me say that again. the possibility existed that the war could end in 1944. Do you know what that means? That means most of the people who died in the death camps wouldn't have died, that most of the bombs that were dropped on German civilians would never have been dropped, that about 38% of the casualties inflicted on the Canadian forces would not have taken place. So never underestimate the challenge that is presented to decision makers when they're trying to understand what is the best way of accomplishing their common purpose, which is to remove from the world the evil of Hitler's National Socialist domination over Central Europe. And as you, I'm sure, know, General Eisenhower suggested that the key thing in the operation was to get to Germany as quickly as possible, and General Montgomery insisted there were only sufficient logistical resources for one deep thrust into Germany. Eisenhower and Montgomery compromised. Montgomery was given the only reserve that was available. All the other divisions were in Europe engaged in combat, but back in England was what was called 1st Airborne Army. 3 airborne divisions, 1 British and 2 American, which many people have described as coins in the army commander's pocket, burning holes because no one how to use them. Indeed, between the end of the Battle of Normandy and September 10th, 1944, no less than 10 serious separate plans for using the airborne army were put forward, and in each case, the ground troops outran the objectives before the airborne troops could be brought to battle. So, in the end, as you know, on the 10th of September, Montgomery persuaded Eisenhower that he would use the airborne divisions to attempt to lay a carpet of airborne troops across the River Rhine and break into Germany in order to achieve ending the war in 1944. This is the famous story of Operation Market Garden, the bridge too far. And what this map is intended to show you is the result of all of this. In the south, the U.S. 7th Army had pressed towards Germany. In the center, U.S. 3rd Army, George Patton's army, was approaching Metz, was beyond Nancy and headed for Alsace. Then 2nd British Army was pressing forward in the next, 1st American, then 2nd British Army, and on the far flank, 1st Canadian Army on what is called the long left flank. This map represents the situation on the 23rd of September, and on the 23rd of September, Montgomery's gamble. I must say, I've always thought Montgomery was right to try Operation Market Garden, even after the evidence began to indicate that German resistance in the area around Arnhem was much stronger than had originally been anticipated. Nevertheless, what we're talking about is if Market Garden works, if 1st British Armoured Division can get across the Rhine, if it can hold the bridge that will allow British 30 Corps to cross the Rhine and turn either east to the Ruhr or west to Holland, then the real possibility exists that Germany will collapse in 1944, and that thing that I talked about before will happen. So this is the situation, but the result, as we all know, is that it was a bridge too far, or maybe it was an idea too soon. The consequence is on September 23rd, we have created a deep salient, a deep, narrow salient, reaching towards, beyond Nijmegen, towards Arnhem, which presents the commanders, the decision makers, with a new set of dilemmas. What will they do in the aftermath of what we'll call, for simplicity, the failure of Operation Market Garden? Well, the argument becomes a very complex one, and I want to begin to focus directly on the Canadians. Sometimes pictures are worth 1,000 words. Not very often, but sometimes. And this picture is worth 1,000 words because it says so much about the command relationship in 21st Army Group among the British and Canadians. On the right-hand side is General Harry Crerar, who's lighting a cigarette, who is separated by distance from Montgomery and Guy Simonds, and from the expression on his face is not involved in the conversation. And that is very characteristic of the whole relationship. Guy Simonds was Montgomery's protege, going back to the Sicilian campaign and the campaign in Italy. Crerar was a contemporary, a First World War veteran who had served alongside Montgomery in the First World War. Montgomery was always nervous about contemporaries. He didn't particularly like Crerar or have a very high opinion of his abilities. He was very, on the other hand, convinced that Simonds was an outstanding general, even though he was a Canadian. This particular picture is admittedly from 1945, but it's just too good to not use in these particular circumstances, because what Montgomery was going to be explaining to Simonds at this particular time is that the narrow salient pointing towards Arnhem either had to be used as a base for attacking the Ruhr, that is, continuing operations from the Arnhem salient towards the German industrial zone in the Ruhr. That was one option. Or the other option was that the available resources of 21st Army Group would be committed to removing the German defenders who were preventing the use of the port of Antwerp. Because on the 5th of September 1944, a British armored division had screamed into Brussels, greeted by the Belgian people rejoicing on the retreat of the German army, and then quickly moved on into Antwerp, where they discovered that the Belgian resistance had seized control of the docks, intact in the largest port in Europe. In all of the logistical dilemmas that the Allies had been confronting with attempting to bring resources across the beaches of Normandy or in through the ruined port of Dieppe or the re-established port at Le Havre would be solved overnight. Everything anyone could want could be landed directly in Antwerp. The difficulty, of course, that Antwerp, I'll come back to Ramsey in a second, that Antwerp was 65 miles from the sea at the end of the Scheldt estuary, the estuary of the River Scheldt, and after September 5th, Hitler had ordered the German army to create what he called Scheldt Fortress South in the Breskens Pocket, where you can see Breskens pretty clearly, the area between the Leopold Canal and Breskens, and Scheldt Fortress North, which was to be Walcheren Island. And the fortress commanders of those two zones were told to defend it to the last man, because so long as those positions were held, the port of Antwerp was useless to the Allies. The guns of Walcheren and the guns of the Breskens Pocket would prevent anyone from entering into the Scheldt estuary. So what Montgomery would be saying to Simonds at this particular point, I mention in parentheses that Crerar went home to England ill, and Simonds took over command of 1st Canadian Army, so now it's simply a Montgomery-Simonds dialogue. What Montgomery would be saying to Simonds is, we are going to take option one. We're going to attempt to build resources and take the Ruhr. We're going to, in other words, expand the salient that we have created as a result of Operation Market Garden, and you, Guy Simonds, and the Canadian Army is going to have to deal with the approaches to the port of Antwerp by clearing the Breskens Pocket, advancing north from Antwerp towards what is called Beveland, the Beveland Isthmus and South Beveland, and then get to Walcheren Island. And all of these things become the responsibility of the Canadian Army. Now, Guy Simonds took this as a challenge. It's admittedly true that even then, when the decision is made on September 26th, that he knows how limited the resources available to the Canadian Army are. I want to spell these out so they're pretty clear in your mind. When the Canadian Army left Normandy, it had under command 2nd Canadian Corps, which consisted of 2 armored divisions, the Polish Armored Division and 4th Canadian Armored Division, and 2 infantry divisions, 2nd and 3rd. But it also had an entire British Corps under command, 1st British Corps, which had 2 infantry divisions and 2 armored brigades. So it's a pretty formidable force. In addition, as an army within the British-Canadian system, it has an entire tactical air group, flying Spitfires and Typhoons and Mustangs, theoretically at its beck and call. A group called 84 Group, which strangely enough wasn't the Canadian group. The Canadian pilots were supporting 2nd British Army. But in theory, we possess our own Air Force in order to carry out the tasks that have been outlined for us on September 26th. The difficulty is that Montgomery's preferred priority, expanding the salient by attacking the Ruhr, requires more and more resources. And he can't get them from the Americans for logistical reasons rather than any other kinds of reasons. So he starts to borrow resources from 1st Canadian Army. And in the course of late September, believe it or not, the Polish Armored Division disappears from the order of battle that Simmons controls. 2 of our 3 armored regiments, the Sherbrooke Fusiliers and the 1st Hussars, are used to support the British thrust. When a British division from 1st British Corps is brought forward, the 49th West Riding Division, the Polar Bears, they are taken away from the Canadian Army, given a Canadian armored unit, and used in support of Montgomery's eastward thrust operation. And so we have lost, in effect, 1 corps, an armored division, 2 of our 3 armored regiments, and then it becomes clear that 84 Group, our tactical air force, isn't really available on a regular basis because it's needed to meet priority targets related to the expansion of the Arnhem salient into the Ruhr. And Simmons' response to all of this is, okay, well, we'll do the best we can under the circumstances. He never challenges his master, never points out the scale of the operation. Fortunately, one person in all of this seems to have a very clear grasp on strategy, operational problems, and even, I would suspect, on army tactics. Admiral Bertram Ramsey is the great unsung hero of operations in Northwest Europe in the Second World War. You may recall, some of you, certainly Mark will, of course, that he was in charge of the withdrawal from Dunkirk, Operation Dynamo. He'd been in charge of the naval aspect of the landings of Sicily. He was over age and had to be recalled to service, but Ramsey was a man of fine intellect, strength of character, and utter determination. And Ramsey, who was in charge of all aspects of what is called Operation Neptune, the naval side of the invasion of Europe in 1944, Ramsey immediately argues that Antwerp and opening the approaches to Antwerp is the only thing that matters in the fall of 1944. And as early as October 3rd, he attacks Montgomery openly in a commander's conference for ignoring this essential fact of everything. If Antwerp isn't opened, there is no logistical support for any kind of advance into Germany, and Ramsey says Montgomery is not paying any attention to this issue. So we have one person who is trying to persuade Eisenhower to take action to overrule Montgomery. Many of you in the business world or in other sectors will know that one of the key problems with the chief executive, and I'm an admirer of Eisenhower's, not a critic of Eisenhower's, is that Eisenhower's approach to command was to try and persuade people to agree with him instead of telling them what to do. And repeatedly through September and October, Eisenhower failed to enforce the very good advice he was getting from Ramsey in relationship to Montgomery's behavior, which increasingly became to ignore the problem of opening the port of Antwerp. So Ramsey's my hero in this period in terms of clear thinking and evidence-based decision-making, something which I deeply admire. So you've understood the problem of the Scheldt. Here we control Antwerp, the locks, the docks, everything, and we can't get to it because of Walcheren and because of the Breskens Pocket. Simmons is a tough bugger, no question of it. Simmons is not warm and fuzzy. He doesn't seek to lead, he seeks to command. Unlike Eisenhower, Simmons has made up his mind it's going to happen, and the rest of you better very quickly get in line. And Simmons' first important decision in this battle is a very, very difficult one, particularly if you've ever been to Walcheren or you know a lot of Dutch people from this area. Because Simmons says, with the resources available to me, this is a parenthesis, Simmons began to plan on the basis of a promise that he could have an American airborne division, the 17th U.S. Airborne Division, which was in England, and he could use it to supplement the limited Canadian resources he had. The airborne people looked at the operation and said, no way are we going to drop paratroopers into this watery grave that surrounds the battlefield all around the Scheldt estuary. Simmons, in fact, repeatedly tried to get Eisenhower to overrule the 17th Airborne Division, but failed. So Simmons is caught, and I accept he's caught in a very deep bind. He says, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to sink Walcheren. We're going to ask RAF Bomber Command to breach the dikes. Walcheren is always compared to a saucer. If you've been there, the dike's 65 feet high. You can stand up on the dike and you look down and you realize the land is much higher than the sea, which is down there. And we take students to the breach in the dikes at West Capelle in order they fully can understand what it means to describe this particular island. And RAF Bomber Command is very skeptical, but they do what they're told. They drop bombs at West Capelle out in the western end of the island, and then near Flushing or Flushing at the south, and then up near Veer in the north, and they flood the island. The sea pours in through the dikes. Now, the importance of this is not only that it will discombobulate the German defenders of the island, isolate them into a very limited area above ground. That really isn't nearly as important as the fact that the breach at West Capelle will allow landing craft, instead of landing at the base of a 65-foot dike, to actually break into the island. And I'll show you what that means a little bit later at West Capelle. Because Admiral Ramsey, again with the clear insight that marks so many of the actions that he took, has taken over the naval aspect of operations in the Scheldt estuary and has said to Simmons, stay out of this, I will create what he called Force T, which was made up of Royal Marine Commandos, landing craft, support craft, and covering ships, including, for those of you who are naval people, HMS Warspite, which engages in its last action during the Scheldt Estuary battle off West Capelle. So the Navy has taken over the question of how we're going to attack Walcheren Island, but in the meantime, the Canadian Army must get on with the issue of the other aspects of the battle. This is a close-up of the Breskens Pocket, where we started the talk, along the Leopold Canal, which is this canal that runs from the sea at Connaught-Heist to the town of Saint-Laurent, which we'll be coming back to at the very end of the lecture. What we're dealing with here is an incredibly difficult situation. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, leaving the battlefields of Calais, moves north, taking over the area south of the canal from the 4th Armored Division. An infantry division has triple the strength of infantry companies or regiments, battalions, in order to undertake the attack. And Simmons, this is called, by the way, Operation Switchback. Simmons makes a decision that, again, demonstrates perhaps the kind of toughness, even ruthlessness, that one requires in a corps commander. Simmons takes the 7th Canadian Infantry Brigade, Western Canada, Regina Rifles, Royal Winnipeg Rifles, Canadian Scottish Regiment from Vancouver Island, and he says what you are going to do is you're going to attack into the Breskens Pocket in the most obvious place, a strip of dry land, which the Germans have not been able to flood, immediately adjacent to the main road, main metalled diked road that leads from Strooiburg in the south all the way up to Breskens in the north, and it's situate a road network that will allow you to move once you're in the battle. All of this ground depicted here is flooded. All of the ground over there is flooded. And the Germans have used their available forces, as you can see by the circles. They have an entire regiment, which is a Canadian equivalent of a brigade, over on the Moorkirk area. Another one, the 1038th, directly opposite where the Canadians are coming. And another one in this section of the pocket. They also have significant reserves, perhaps 14,000 fighting soldiers available to the German army in the Breskens Pocket, versing a Canadian infantry division whose strength in October was roughly, not counting simply infantry, but everyone 16,000, so perhaps 12,000 infantry. I call Simmons tough because this is almost a suicide mission. So the answer to my question, why were the Regina Rifles attempting to cross the Leopold Canal on the 6th of October under conditions of terrain and German defenses that are almost unbelievable, is that Simmons had decided what he was going to do was find and fix and fight the enemy on the southern end of the Leopold Canal, while he took advantage of a new combat multiplier, if I can use that term, that had arrived from the United States and from the Pacific Theater of War. A landing vehicle tracked is the military terminology called a Buffalo. A buffalo was an amphibious vehicle which could go into the water, move through the water, and climb a slope. And what Simmons was going to do with a regiment of buffaloes was to take them over to Terneuzen, the port, which is over just slightly off the map, take them out into the Scheldt estuary, and come in the back door of the Breskens pocket. The switchback, for once, is a term, a code word that actually has some meaning. The switchback would be to bring the 9th Brigade, the 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade, into the back of the pocket and undo the whole nature of the German defenses. But in order to do that, he had to first pin the enemy's attention on the Leopold Canal. So if the 7th Brigade had to go across into that narrow strip of dry land, and if the men had to survive the difficulties, October 6th, 7th would go by, 8th, 9th, 10th, the LVTs, the buffaloes, got stuck in the locks, and switchback's second phase had to be postponed. But the 7th Brigade simply had to put up with all of that. The consequence was that the Highland Light Infantry from Waterloo, Ontario, and the North Nova Scotia Highlanders landed at Green and Amber Beach up in the northeast corner of the pocket, met virtually no resistance, quickly established a beachhead, and began the process of unlocking the defenses of the pocket. Indeed, for 7th Brigade, nothing happened to relieve their situation until the forces from the eastern side of the pocket reached them. This is a close-up from our air photograph collection. We inherited at Wilfrid Laurier a massive collection of air photographs that 1st Canadian Air Photo Interpretation Unit had used to make maps in the First World War. I've told this story in public, so I guess I'm allowed to tell it here. One of my graduate students actually drove a budget rent-all truck to Ottawa because we learned that the Old War Museum, which had very poor facilities and very poor funding, was throwing out a collection of air photographs. And when Sean got there, they were actually on the loading dock. The choice was us or a garbage dump was going to take them away. So we brought the collection back in the early 1980s and have used it in a number of ways. In this particular case, you can see without difficulty the bunker that I've shown you 2 or 3 times at the Leopold Canal, the broken bridge at Strooiberg, and the narrow strip of ground. All of this terrain, by the way, is visitable today in exactly the condition you see here, except that north of Graf Jan, the area is flooded or saturated and impassable. So this narrow triangle of land leading to this main highway that will go up to Breskens is where 7th Brigade is to attack and, if you will, draw the enemy upon it. Fortunately, the Germans respond exactly as Simmons wanted them to. They poured resources in the defeat of 7th Brigade and had virtually nothing left to deal with what we are talking about here, Green and Amber Beach. This is what it looks like today. Gives you a kind of way of understanding what the Buffaloes were able to accomplish, because the mud flats were as they are today in 1944. So the Buffaloes would come in from the Scheldt estuary, that's Walcheren Island in the far background, and come into this dike area that keeps the Breskens pocket above sea level as well, and the Buffaloes would be able to climb up and bring the infantry sections directly on the German defenses. So switchback worked. It worked in the sense that between October 6th and November 3rd, 1944, dike after dike, polder after polder, the 3rd Canadian Division fought its way forward. I always remember a company commander. His name was Harry Knox. He was a Royal Winnipeg Rifle Company commander, as it happens. And he explained to me of the day when they were just coming out of one of these nasty little battles at the junction of a dike. Because all you could do is lay down a certain amount of fire support, make the infantry go forward, lay the fire support further, bring up a Wasp flamethrower or something. And once you got that dike away from the Germans, you peeked over the top and there was another one 500 meters away, and then another one, and another one, and another one, like a miniature fortress of these things raised up. So Harry said that, Knox said that this particular day Montgomery arrived. Motorcycles out front, a car, Simmons with him, and wanting to know at the front line why it was taking so long to finish clearing the Scheldt estuary. Now, Knox said, and I don't believe him for a moment, these are the kind of soldiers that stories like to tell, that one of the soldiers, one of the officers said to Montgomery, "Well, sir, if you'd like to show us how to do it, we'd be happy to show you where the front is." I think there's more to that story than matters. I think the Canadians, by mid-October, given the state of 3rd Canadian Division, I've written extensively about battle exhaustion, the post-traumatic stress disorder, our shell shock of the era. We know that hundreds of young Canadians had fallen apart in the context of the stress that was imposed on them in the Scheldt, had gone to rest stations where a very sympathetic, New Brunswick actually, psychiatrist, Dick Gregory, was attempting to deal with them. And Gregory's report is very clear. He says, we cannot send these men back into action until at the very least they've had a considerable period of rest. But the shortage of infantry was so great that almost all of the men in the rest stations for not yet diagnosed nervous battle exhaustion were in fact reintegrated into units during the course of late October. Again, it's not clear that there were any very good choices under the circumstances of the time. We are therefore dealing with a situation in which 3rd Division is beginning to be far more concerned with protecting the lives of their comrades than moving at the pace that the generals would like to see the battle fought. And therefore, I think, in fact, the generals legitimately criticize the patience, the conservatism, the caution of the company commanders in the Canadian Army. While the clearance of the Breskens Pocket is taking place, and as I said, it takes till November 3rd, the 2nd Canadian Division has been brought over to take over the defenses of the town or city of Antwerp, and they are now ordered to move north towards Wansdreck, which we'll be talking about in a moment. Once they secure Wansdreck, they're to hang a left out into South Beveland and head as quickly as possible towards Walcheren. That's the operational goal that is given to Bruce Matthews and the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division in these circumstances. So, Antwerp to Wansdreck, hang a left out into South Beveland is what you're supposed to do. The difficulty is that the German army has, in the course of the period, got troops across the Scheldt estuary, evacuated them out through South Beveland, and begun to build defenses north of Antwerp. So while Antwerp is free, north of the city, substantial German forces exist that have to be overcome. The Canadians do a good job initially of breaking through the defenses and proceed to the edge. They're down here in Hoogerheide, which is only today part of an extended urban area that goes over towards Wansdreck. But they are now suddenly confronted with significant German reinforcements. In particular, what has happened is the German Army's fire brigade in this sector, 6th Parachute Regiment, a regiment that had fought against the Americans in Normandy, had been refurbished by young paratroopers from Germany, has come to hold, if you can see the area that is marked in dark green, this is where terrain matters so much. All of this country is polder country. It's either below sea level or at sea level. Except in the Wansdreck area, there is a large sandy ridge. It only rises 15 meters above the existing ground. And only an infantier can understand the significance of 15 meters, because the Wansdreck Ridge, which is wooded in its eastern side, provides a classic, highly defensible military position. It provides a reverse slope where the artillery and mortars can be protected from observation, and it provides a forward edge that allows the German infantry, machine guns, etc., and never mind observers, to see the Canadians as they approach. Once again, we are dealing with a battle at Wansdreck between 2nd Division and the 6th Parachute Regiment of the German Army, in which the odds are roughly equal. The ratio here may be 1.2 to 1 in the battles that are fought, but not better than that. All of this a price of the decision to give priority to the advance to the Ruhr. We are now in a situation which is quite famous in Canadian military history. Over here on the left, on the 13th of October, the decision is made to try and bypass Wansdreck and the Sandy Ridge and reach the railway line that goes into Beveland, and the Black Watch from Montreal is chosen to undertake this. The Black Watch had had a disastrous day in Normandy when they lost most of the men in the battalion. Rebuilt, they had another Black Friday on the 13th of October, 1944, when they attempted to reach the railway line, only to find dug-in German paratroopers able to prevent them from securing the railway line. And once again, their losses amounted to virtually catastrophic. 3 days later, the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, one of the most consistently successful infantry battalions in the war, under the leadership of the late Denny Whittaker, was given the task of trying the other possibility, which was to secure the ridge by frontal assault. The story of the Rileys' attempt to secure that ridge, with Denny calling artillery fire down on his own positions in order to fend off the German counterattacks, has been told many times, and it's a story of absolutely incredible heroism and endurance that, for a sense, needs to be explored. But the real issue becomes, why was only one infantry battalion available to attack a ridge on a front over 3,000 yards long, in which the German defenders not only are well dug in, but have ample reserves to return the attack? Well, the answer lies in the whole dilemma that 1st Canadian Army is in these operations. After the Battle of Wandsdreck is won, careful because of time, Terry, it is won because finally, on the 16th of October, 1944, Ramsey once again intervenes and tells Eisenhower that the advance of the Canadians in the Scheldt estuary in order to save the possibility of opening Antwerp before winter sets in is being lost. The Canadians lack ammunition, they lack manpower, they lack resources. What is Montgomery doing? Finally, Eisenhower becomes a CEO instead of an individual who's persuading his subordinates, and orders Montgomery to devote priority and resources to the opening of the port of Antwerp. Almost immediately, everything changes. In the short run, what happens is the 4th Canadian Armored Division is given fuel and ammunition and is released to come up on the right flank, the eastern flank of where 2nd Canadian Division is fighting. And 49th West Riding Division, which is now again under Canadian command, is on their right flank. So we now have massive thrust going past the German defenses, which will unlock all of the attempt of the Germans to continue to hold Wandsdreck. Next comes the unbelievable Battle of the Walcheren Causeway. Beveland falls relatively easily. The Canadians rush madly towards this narrow causeway, which carries a railway line and a road between South Beveland and what was then Walcheren Island. I keep complaining when I particularly have a lot of Dutch people in the audience that the damn Dutch keep changing the terrain on me. I keep filling in the ground, so you can't find the Walcheren Causeway anymore unless you have a guide. In fact, the highway, which is now a 4-lane superhighway, crosses exactly where it was. And if you get off the highway, you can find the old stonework that protected the causeway, but you've got to know where to look. But in 1944, it was to be compared to a long gun barrel, with the bad guys at one end with very considerable resources and Canadian infantrymen at the other ordered to cross. One of the most dramatic versions of all of this can be seen at the museum in Calgary, the Museum of the Regiments, where the Calgary Highlanders are from. I've written a fair amount about the Calgary Highlanders, and at one time, I think I had 15 officers, NCOs, and privates whom I was corresponding with when I was writing the book, The Brigade, and I used to spend time out in Calgary and in other parts of the West interviewing them. This is the image that the Calgary Highlanders used to illustrate the crossing of the causeway. This is the Germans this way and the Calgarys rushing against it, a little German position being overcome here. Every year in Calgary on the anniversary of Walcheren, there's a Walcheren dinner, which I've spoken at, which is a kind of commemoration of this particular action. Suffice it to say that context is everything. To ask young men, in this case a battalion, To attack across a causeway under these circumstances is almost unbelievable. Why then? Well, the answer is clear-cut, though most Canadian historians seem to not know it for very many years. The reason is that Force T, the Royal Marine Commandos that Admiral Ramsey has organized, are going to land early on the hours of the morning of the 1st of November. And what, once again, the Canadians must do is draw German attention away from an extremely dangerous landing, highly risky landing, under weather conditions that couldn't be more adverse, much more dangerous landing than at Dieppe, or for that matter, anywhere on D-Day. And the Canadians are asked to attack across the causeway to continue to fulfill the German vision of how Walcheren Island will be attacked. And it works, except for the men who don't make it. Once again, the circumstances, I think, explain a great deal about the price that was put forward. This is what West Capella looked like that morning. You can see the bomb craters that have landed around it. You can see the breach that has been made in the dikes. You can see the village on the right-hand side of the image with the sea pouring in. And it's a catastrophe which will take the people of Walcheren Island a very long time to recover from. I'll just tell you a little story about that. We did a lecture in Ottawa with for the Dutch Embassy put on with a friend of mine who's a historian in the Netherlands, Ben Schumacher. Mark is going to be lecturing opposite Ben in Edmonton or Calgary, I can't remember which, later in the year. Ben's version of this was from the Dutch point of view. And one of the things that Ben said that I simply had never thought of before, because I thought of the misery inflicted upon the people in this flooded island. They lost their livestock, they lost their farms, they had to be evacuated. But Ben said, well, you know, they were, first of all, deeply religious. It was an island of Dutch Reform, Calvinist, very small Roman Catholic minority, but people deeply believing in Providence. And they thought their sacrifice mattered. They thought they had contributed to the defeat of Nazi Germany and the liberation of Holland through their sacrifice. And Ben didn't want anyone to take that away from them. I found that a really deeply moving moment, and I literally had never thought of it from that particular perspective. When you visit Walcheren today, the dike's been rebuilt, but part of the breach has been turned into a lake, which allows you to get a sense of what it was like. It is, of course, a beautiful, idyllic island today, and full of tourists during the summer season. Back to Alex Colville. Alex painted, it's a sketch actually, this little image, which he called Exercise Relax, because in the aftermath of the fighting for the Scheldt Estuary, the troops of 2nd and 3rd Canadian Division were worn beyond endurance. And they were allowed to simply go and live with civilians in Ghent, in Bruges, and other Belgian towns. And you would think that maybe what young men did is went out and got drunk and chased girls. Most of them slept. They slept in beds. And they had breakfast, and they went looking for food, and they wandered through undamaged Belgian cities. Neither Ghent nor Bruges had been affected directly by the war. And that's what Operation Relax was. And I said it lasted all of 4 days before they were put on trucks and taken to take over the Nijmegen salient in order to defend it. So he's just, I think that I like this particularly because there are the soldiers and they're just standing around. They're just for a moment being out of war. And that's all that really matters to them. This Colville painting is much later. It arises out of his sense of what it all means. In this particular case, the soldier is coming home, and those of you who know his paintings will recognize the style as a much later development from his Second World War war art. But again, there he is, the young man coming home in a railway station, and very, very much trying to echo the feelings that people had at the time. Let me conclude. I hope there'll be questions, but let me conclude by moving to the commemoration issue. Lee talked about the Canadian Battlefields Foundation, which we organized in the 1990s and used battlefield tours as a way of bringing it to hundreds of Canadian university students as part of what I guess is called commemoration. One of the things that we discover, particularly in the Netherlands, though to a remarkable degree in France, and Lee and Cindy are either discovering it or creating it in Sicily, I'm not sure which, but they're relating to the local population in a very new way that is very important. What we're doing here is visiting the cemetery in Adigum, which is where those who were killed in the operations to clear the Breskens pocket are buried. It's a large cemetery. Over 1,000 men lost their lives in the battle. And most Canadians never go there. I remember Lee and I have a long and I think very close relationship. So I often remember things that he says and the emotion that he brings to the battlefield. This happened to take place at the Calais Cemetery, which is even more neglected than the Adigum Cemetery. But Lee said to the students as they were going in, he was by now a tour director, not a student, say something to them. No one ever comes to visit them. They'll be glad to know Canadians are here. Well, I always feel that way about Adigum and Bergen-op-Zoom as well. But the Dutch and Belgian people in Flanders feel very differently about this. We talk about memory, we talk about remembrance, but what the Dutch talk about is liberation, the freedom from Nazi occupation and from the terror. Young Dutch men had become divers, trying to hide away from the German conscription for war service in Germany. Others had practiced resistance as best they could in a wide open country. In this particular case, in the Breskens pocket on the Dutch-Belgian border, there is enormous attention paid to it. Last weekend, I missed it again. I always promised myself I would do this, but every first weekend in November, commemorating the liberation of the Breskens pocket and the Belgian-Dutch area, there is a march from Hoofdplaat near Amber and Green Beach all the way to Kanakahuis, 32 kilometers. In the olden days when we had troops in Europe, Canadian troops used to participate and there were bands and flags and the school children marched and it was a grand spectacle. It's become a much smaller scale, but every year they march the 32 kilometers and at Kanakahuis in Canada Place, the last ceremonies are held to commemorate the liberation. The same thing has now started in South Beveland and on the Walcheren Island. We won't go there, we'll come back to Adigum. Last time I was there with a group of students, a local school from that little village I mentioned, St. Lorenz, which was destroyed during the fighting of the war, had adopted Adigum Cemetery and the Canadian soldiers buried there, and we'd made contact with them, and they came to the cemetery to meet us. And we had the Canadian ambassador to Brussels and the Polish ambassador to Brussels, because many Poles are buried there as well. And I was, in this particular picture, explaining, and someone was translating. These young kids are learning English, but their English is not yet fluent, as it will be in a few years in this part of Belgium and Holland. But these young people are waiting for the end of the translation about what was happening here, although it turned out they knew quite a lot about it. Here are the students, the young kids, presenting to my students a little token of the work that they had done in school in preparation for our visit to the Adigum Cemetery. And this is what they gave us: a maple leaf and a poppy that they had made in the school. And each of them had adopted 2 or 3 graves and knew enough about the soldier to actually be able to tell us. It was fascinating. Each of my students had to do a biography, and many of them there in the Adigum Cemetery. And these little kids were taking them by the hand to show them where the grave was. They actually knew where the grave of many of the soldiers were. So each of us were given this. And here we are, in this particular case, putting a flag at the grave of a Polish trooper who was killed during the course of the battle in September 1944, age 33. And you can see the young people in the background watching as each of the university students places a flag or a commemorative plaque at the particular site. There were not, I'll have to admit, very many dry eyes, even among some fairly cynical university students. This is my last slide. It uses at the top a phrase that the Canadian Battlefields Foundation places on the plaques that we've organized in Europe. I'm hoping that the University of New Brunswick people will take over some aspects of this job We now have placed about 12 plaques, all of which were frankly designed and paid for at Wilfrid Laurier University, but we won't say that too hard in public, in which we've tried to commemorate Canadian battlefields in Normandy and elsewhere by working on what I called informed memory. Not simply saying, remember, but this is why you should remember. These are who these young people were. So we need one badly in Bruges. We need another one badly at the Leopold Canal. I could go on, but I won't tonight. And on the bottom of the plaques we've raised, we looked very hard for words, particularly for the Black Watch on Verrières Ridge, trying to say something that spoke to the essence of what the Canadian role in Northwest Europe in the Second World War was, Northwest Europe and in Italy. And the phrase we use is they fought for the liberation of Europe and the hope of a better world. Not the promise of a better world, not the guarantee of anything, but the hope of a better world. And for all of us Canadians, to a certain degree, we share in that story of liberation. Thank you very much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Professor Copp has agreed to take a few questions from the floor, and it's my task to see if I can actually see you and see if anyone sticks their hand up. So we have a few minutes. We'll have opportunity during the reception. If you have questions, you could raise them then. So please try to make your questions short. I'm obliged to actually repeat your question, so we actually have it recorded. So the floor is open for questions.
Well, I come back to the phrase that I finished the lecture with. They weren't fighting for any guarantees. They were fighting for the hope of a better world. In the First World War, people went to war believing that it was a war to end wars, that small nations would be free, that the League of Nations would solve all of these problems. The veterans of 1940, 43, 45 had in a sense been through that, either through their parents or through their own understanding of the way the situation evolved. All that they really knew is that what Hitler and National Socialism and the control of Europe stood for was worse than anything that anyone could imagine. And their job was to end that tyranny, the most monstrous tyranny ever known to mankind. And I don't think they, at least certainly the ones that I knew well in the post-war period, were terribly surprised by the Cold War, by the continuation of conflict. I think it's a burden that appears to be inescapable. I don't have any advice, as I'm sure you don't, about what actually should be done in the conditions that take place in places like the Congo or Eritrea or Syria. How that can be brought to a successful conclusion is simply beyond my ability, or as far as I can tell anyone else's, to analyze. So I suppose one does one's best, one hopes for a better future, one tries to impose one's values as a human being on the situation to the best of your ability. But it would simply be foolish to imagine there is any clear-cut or clean solution. We can only do our best, which is what our veterans did.
Sorry, could you repeat that again, please?
Yes, Antwerp, sorry, Mark, go ahead.
Well, yeah, the question was there any role for the Dutch resistance after the fall of Antwerp?
Yeah. Just for the record, Antwerp fell to the Belgian resistance. Belgium is a lost part of our story until you're in Belgium and you realize how important it was. The Belgian resistance was members of the Belgian army who had gone underground, highly organized, and they seized the port of Antwerp. Were really mad because the British were so slow to take over for them. And many Belgian soldiers from the Belgian White Resistance continued to fight with Canadian units as they moved into the Netherlands, where Dutch resistance joined with the Canadians in a number of actions. The difficulty in, not the difficulty, but the challenge for the Netherlands is they're trying desperately to reestablish their own army. So the Princess Irene Brigade, the Dutch Army Brigade, which works with the Canadians, is partly concerned with trying to assist the civil authorities in reestablishing good government in the Netherlands, which has suffered through this incredible period of occupation. And individual Canadian soldiers at the platoon level love having Belgium and Dutch resistance soldiers with them, if for nothing else than the language issue. But the army is very nervous about civilians involved in the fighting.
Quick question. Most Canadians don't know of these stories, these battles. Why is that?
Terry, just quickly, the question is, why don't most Canadians know about these battles?
Well, I think a very long time ago, probably in the lifetime of your children, certainly grandchildren, Canadian history in general became less and less important in the schools of the country. And if some of this is not put forward in the high schools to lay a foundation, then it's really hard to move forward. Dave Alexander and his colleague who are here tonight, I went up to their classroom in Owen Sound as they started next year's project and talked to a large class of essentially grade 10, which is where in Ontario a little bit of Canadian history is taught. And Dave and many other high school teachers do a superb job of bringing this directly to the students. But there's nothing in curricular direction in most of the provinces of Canada that would allow this to become an important part. Remember, I started and I said 2 of the most important chapters in Canadian history, not the only important chapters, but 2 of the most important chapters of Canadian history occurred in those 2 wars. And I, of course, would argue this is something every Canadian should be exposed to. Then there's the problem of the CBC, but not tonight. Not going to go there tonight.
Do you have any information or history of prisoners of war that were taken on either side during that battle?
Information on prisoners of war taken on either side during the Battle of the Scheldt.
Well, one of the best known incidents in the Breskens pocket is when an entire platoon, almost a company, gets surrounded and taken prisoner in the middle of the battle, and then they're released when we make it to the Kanaka heist, because there's no way of getting them out of the Breskens pocket, so we get them back. I think that the evidence is pretty crystal clear. We would have lost very few prisoners in the Battle of the Scheldt from the Canadian side, just given the way in which the fighting evolved. German prisoners were massive. One of the things that is really scary to soldiers, and when I was talking to them I found this really unnerving, is if there were 12,000 German soldiers in the Breskens pocket, about 10,000 of them surrendered. But they only surrendered when their own lives were in danger. In other words, when the Canadians had maneuvered using infantry tactics. They had no armored support, so we're talking entirely about infantry tactics. And that Dyke Junction was under direct fire. The white flags would go up, and they would march happily off to prisoner of war camp, where they were taken to first wire cages and then transported back to Britain. At that stage of the war, I don't think very many of them made it to Canada. Earlier in the war, many of the German prisoners were taken back to Canada or from other theaters to the United States. But I'm pretty sure in late 1944, they made it to Britain and were never sent further on. And they were overwhelmingly treated under the conditions of the Geneva Convention, prisoners from the Eastern Front, until the very last stages of the war when the death marches occurred. And many Canadians lost their lives when the Germans were attempting to move the prisoners of war away from the advancing Allied armies. That certainly was the experience of many of those captured at Dieppe in 1942. But the numbers captured in the Scheldt would be minimal from the western side.
Time for one more. There is one. Way back.
Cited 2 instances tonight where Canadians could fire while something else was going on. And you mentioned
No, I think it's genuinely accidental. It really is a question of who is on the long left flank. And early in the planning of Operation Overlord, 1st Canadian Army was scheduled to be on that flank. No one could have anticipated Operation Market Garden. No one could have anticipated that Montgomery would insist upon trying to reach the Ruhr. And no one could have anticipated that the Canadian Army, Cinderella Army, would continue to be stripped of resources. Same thing's true for Dieppe. The Canadians wanted very, very badly to participate in the Dieppe raid, argued for inclusion in the first place, and then argued when the first Dieppe raid, Rutter, was canceled and Jubilee was reinstated. The Canadians wanted very much for the raid to take place. I'm not in any way developing an anti-British or anti-Montgomery perspective. I'm not even sure Montgomery was wrong in his attempt to reach the Ruhr in October 1944. But I'm a Canadian historian studying the consequences of all of this for Canadians, and I want Canadians to understand that against what appeared to be overwhelming odds, the young men from our country were able to achieve the goals that were necessary. And that's why the Scheldt Campaign, by the way, is certainly the most important Canadian campaign of the war. It's the only joint and combined campaign in which Simmons has influence/control over an air force, a navy. Every aspect of war-making skills can be brought together in order to accomplish the goal of opening the port of Antwerp and laying the foundation for the liberation of Europe in 1945. And that, much more than D-Day, is the central achievement of the Canadian forces in Northwest Europe in 1944.
Thank you. It's my happy task at this point to thank our speaker. And because historians often disagree, I'm going to have to send Terry a picture of my father taken in Ghent in November of 1944, standing next to a very attractive young woman in a taffeta dress, looking just like the cat who caught the canary. That's all I can tell you. I haven't been able to get to the bottom of that one.
But his dad was a gunner, and you never can tell what gunners are going to do.
As many of you will know, there's probably no historian living or, I dare say, expired who has done more to resuscitate, to revise, to rejuvenate, to actually energize the study of the Canadian Army in the Second World War than Terry Copp. What you saw this evening was just a sample of the passion and the purpose that he brings to everything he does in this field, and he has, for many of us, been an inspiration and a leader in the rejuvenation and revitalization of a subject which I have to tell you still warrants examination, and we still know very little about it in the sense that there's a great deal left to be done. There are many, not only stories to be told, but a great many battles left to analyze, not least because historians tend to focus on the high-profile ones and forget the ones that take place off stage, like the Scheldt Estuary. So on your behalf, I'd like to thank Terry Copp, and I'd like to ask you to join me in a round of applause.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
That was great. And I have one final duty to do before I hand the podium over to Bob Skillen, and that's to tell you to put this week in your calendar for next year. Next year's Eaton lecturer, will be Sir Max Hastings. Many of you who know Max Hastings' work on the Second World War will be here in November to give the 2016 Eaton Lecture. Thank you for your attendance.
Thank you very much, Mark. I don't know that you introduced yourself when you came up to the podium. You're in the program, but people can't see because it's dark. So Mark is the director of the Gregg Center, and he was the first lecturer, and Lee Windsor, who is the deputy director in the Eaton chair, was the second lecturer. I've had the good fortune of working with the Gregg Center for the past 10 years, helping to draw resources in to support a center of excellence at the University of New Brunswick. And I've heard them speak, Lee and Mark speak often and Cindy of this great Terry Copp from Laurier University. So it was a real pleasure this evening, Terry, to finally meet you and to hear you. And it's completely understandable why Lee Windsor is the way that he is today. I've had also the good fortune of going on a couple of battlefield tours with Mark, the first to Normandy and this past spring to the Netherlands, and was in the Netherlands for the 70th anniversary celebration. Cindy talked about John Flamer. John Flamer died this past summer at the age of 94. I met him 3 years ago, he and Lucinda, and at that time in South Carolina, he leaned across the couch towards me and said, "Bob, I'd like to do something at the University of New Brunswick to thank Canada for what it did for my country in the Second World War." John had escaped the Netherlands, fought with the Allies, and he wanted to do something, and so he spurred us on to go into the Netherlands, and we'll be forever grateful for that support. A special thank you this evening again to the supporters of the Gregg Center, especially to Dr. Frederick S. Eaton, his family and their foundation, and to John Irving. Now I invite all of you to a reception in the Rotunda where Professor Copp will be signing copies of his book, Cinderella Army, the Canadians in Northwest Europe, 1944 to 1945. Thank you again for coming. We'll see you again next year. Thank you.